Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to the third annual Global Studies lecture featuring Harvard Professor of History, Dr. Maya Jasanoff. My name is Andrew Kless. I'm an Assistant Professor of History and Global Studies at Alfred University and the Director of our Global Studies program. AU Global Studies is a growing interdisciplinary major-minor that seeks to cultivate global citizenship within our students, prioritizing study abroad, foreign language, and coursework that ranges from art history to international business. For those of you that are interested in global studies as a major or minor, or would like to get involved as a faculty member, please feel free to visit our webpage. I'd like to thank the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences for generously supporting this lecture. That includes Dave Toot, Susan Morehouse, and Bob Stein, the deans from the last year, all three of them. I'd also like to thank Mari Yark and Karen Glick and the whole of the Global Studies faculty for helping bring this all together. And I'd like to thank you all for being here as well. The plan is Dr. Jasanoff will give her lecture, but feel free to leave your comments in the chat during the lecture. After the lecture, I'll read the comments, and then finally we'll open up and unmute everyone, and you can ask any remaining questions to Dr. Jasanoff yourself. With that, I turn it over to one of the founders of the Global Studies program and professor of anthropology, Bob Myers.
Andrew, thank you very much. I'm so delighted to see Professor Jasanoff here. Professor Jasanoff, colleagues, friends, students, thank you all for coming. I couldn't be more delighted than for Professor Maya Jasanoff to be our Global Studies speaker this evening. Let me offer a few details about Professor Jasanoff for you to see why this is such a special evening. This may take a while, but I'll try to leave Professor Jasanoff a few minutes to tell us about her current research on ancestors. Professor Jasanoff knows Western New York because she grew up in Ithaca. In fact, she knows our area well. As peripatetic as those she's written about, during the first COVID summer, she took a solo car trip from Cambridge to the hot, dry West and posted striking Instagram pictures on the way. Trips like this, she wrote, became an unlooked for gift of the pandemic. I think she even waved to us in Alfred as she passed exit 33 on I-86. After Ithaca, Professor Jasanoff earned degrees in history from Harvard, Cambridge, and Yale. She taught at the University of Michigan and the University of Virginia before returning to Harvard, where she is now XD and Nancy Yang Professor and Coolidge Professor of History, specializing in the British Empire and global history, as well as myriad connections among literature, art history, and global changes, all paths leading her to think and write about our ancestors populating these worlds. Her undergraduate course last spring on ancestors was one of Harvard's most popular. Professor Jasanoff also teaches part-time at Ahmedabad University in Western India. This year, she's on leave from Harvard. In December, she'll deliver the Lawrence Stone Lectures at Princeton on connections between fiction and history writing in English. Her remarkable career includes a Guggenheim, as well as serving as a fellow at the New York Public Library's Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, a Klug Chair at the Library of Congress, and a member of the otherworldly academic nirvana, the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Her essays and review essays appear in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the New Republic, the Guardian, and many other places. Each of her 3 books has won major awards. 2005's Edge of Empire, Lives, Culture, and Conquest in the East, 1750 to 1850, was honored with the Duff Cooper Prize. 2011's Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary World, is the first global history of the Loyalists who fled the United States after the American Revolution and resettled elsewhere in the British Empire. For this, she received the National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction and the George Washington Book Prize. The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World, published in 2017, has been called by renowned Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o masterful, and by a Wall Street Journal reviewer, the most vivid and suggestive biography of Conrad ever written. It earned the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize and the 2018 Cundill History Prize. Always layered, she concludes the book with a visit to Conrad in his patch of Kentish ground, noting that the name of one of the greatest writers in English inscribed on his rough-hewn granite headstone is misspelled and a mix of Polish and English. Throughout 2021, all of this year, Professor Jasanoff was not busy enough teaching and writing, so she became chair of the Booker Prize Selection Committee for Best Works Written Globally in English. This has required reading many dozens, literally 3-foot-tall stacks of novels. The committee announced the Booker long list earlier this summer, the short list of 6 books last week, and will declare its final choice on November 3rd. Okay, you've just heard the ritual recitation of the sparkling jewels on the mantle worn by a brilliant superstar. Prizes and honors of every kind, the highest levels of academic accomplishment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But facets of the endlessly curious person who created these works, investing them with such imagery and analysis, which charmed my capstone class in global studies in 2018 when we read and discussed the Dawn Watch. One member of that class is here. Hi, Taylor Jasko, Alfred's most recent Fulbrighter. Maya Jasanoff captures a story at all levels. She gives vivid meaning to anthropologist writer Zora Neale Hurston's description of research as formalized curiosity. It's poking and prying with a purpose. It is through the details and humanity within her global view that Maya brings life to her histories. She went to every place throughout Europe that Conrad must have gone, but that wasn't nearly enough. She went to sea for much more. Maya booked passage on a huge container cargo ship, nearly the size of the Empire State Building, pushed on its side, floating on its side, and blogged about her 27-day voyage from Hong Kong to Southampton by way of Singapore, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean, and eventually to England. She felt the relentless swells and heaves of a long-distance voyage and finished the trip experiencing nearly hurricane-force winds and massive waves close to England. As the only passenger and only woman with a 30-man international crew, she tells us what it was like to dine at the captain's table conversing in French, but also to be prepared for attack by Somali pirates, which would force retreat to the ship's safe room, as well as to prepare dinner herself for everyone on board. Unsatisfied with the container ship experience and inspired to feel something of what Conrad experienced, she sailed across the Atlantic on a 134-foot, 2-masted ship carrying several thousand feet of sail. Not many distinguished writers describe the ocean as the basin of a billion vomits, as she made her own contributions to Homer's wine dark sea. Another time, I had to say that, Mar. Another time, with Conrad's Heart of Darkness on her mind, she traveled up the Congo River to feel tropical heat and sweat, to see what had changed and what hadn't changed over the past century. Her account begins, "The smoked monkeys brought the point home. During my first day on a boat on the Congo River, I'd embraced the unfamiliar, how to bend under the rail to fill my wash bucket from the river, where to step around the tethered goat in the dark, and the best way to prepare a pot of grubs. But when I saw the monkeys impaled on stakes, skulls picked clean of brains and teeth thrusting out, I looked otherness in the face and saw myself mirrored back." Change of setting and pace. Last week on Instagram, Maya is in a makeup chair in Poland for a talk on Conrad. She begins her post with TFW, that feeling when, or perhaps some other meaning, and so it goes. Professor Jasanoff's experience is global, and her perspective epitomizes the liberal education we cultivate at Alfred University. She is the perfect person to deliver our distinguished global studies lecture. I'm hoping the next time she's flying west on I-86 and sees exit 33, she'll take a few moments to join us for an open invitation for refreshments at the Terracotta Coffee House. Welcome, Professor Jasanoff. So nice to see you.
Thank you, Professor Myers, and to all of you who are here. I feel like after that introduction, the best thing I can do for myself is say nothing, because it's all going to be downhill from here, or downstream at any rate. I'm waving to you guys in Western New York. I mean, as as Professor Myers said, I'm a native of Ithaca. I'm very attached to upstate New York and try to get back there when I can. And I'm sorry not to be spending this first day of fall with you in person there. Instead, I suppose in keeping with the brief to speak on global studies, I am going to tell you a little bit about the book that I'm currently endeavoring to write, which is a modest little history of the human preoccupation with ancestry from the beginning of from the origins of Homo sapiens to the DNA tests of today. And so in the next kind of 40 minutes or so, I'll try to give you a flavor of what it is that I'm doing. So let me share my screen. Because I have the luxury of being on sabbatical this year, I actually have not had to fiddle with the multiple screen issue that, but let me, in a while. Okay, let me do this. Here you go. You can see that. Okay, is everything good? If Bob or Andrew can put a wave. Okay, excellent. All right, so you don't have to look very far right now to know that ancestry is a thing. Genealogical research, let me just make my, okay, there we go. Genealogical research is one of the fastest growing hobbies in America. And apparently terms related to genealogy are among the most widely searched categories online. And I will leave it to your imaginations to fill in what is in fact the most widely searched category of terms online. In any case, genealogy is very popular online. Ancestry.com is just one of many sources, websites that delivers digitized documents. It is the biggest. Ancestry is a new scientific technology. More than 26 million Americans have taken genetic ancestry tests. These were launched almost 10 years ago now, but really the explosion of people taking these has been over the last 4 or 5 years. By the time 26 million plus people have taken them, including perhaps some of you, it means that nearly all of the 300 plus million people in the US can one way or another be identified through these things if your sixth cousin or something has ended up taking one. So anyway, they're incredibly widespread and popular. Ancestry is also kind of in our politics, and for that matter, in our laws. The case of Elizabeth Warren was one that brought to the forefront the question of, who claims indigenous descent and how and on what basis, and brought out the distinctions that are drawn between the definition of belonging through tribal sovereignty, which is determined by each tribe, versus genetic definitions and so on. Anyway, really brought ancestry into public and political debate and discussion. And on a somewhat similar note, ancestry is also very much in our history and our public conversation. Here in the United States right now, it's bound up with debates about memorialization and reparative justice. And I would note that discussions about memorials and reparations and so on are going on in other parts of the world as well, notably the metropoles of the European empires, which dominated the world until just into the mid to late 20th century. So ancestry, as I say, it's a thing. It's the stuff of primetime television, best-selling books, stories about family secrets and discoveries, and genetic genealogy, solving cold cases, and all of this kind of stuff popping up regularly in the news these days. However, while some of the tools and the stories around ancestry right now may be new, the preoccupation with where we come from as both individuals and as collectives, as societies, is anything but new. These digitized databases of documents are new, but they depend on the vast archives of vital statistics, identity documents, censuses, immigration and citizenship records that have been assembled by the modern state over many hundreds of years. The genetic tests may be new, but they rest in terms of the way they deliver the results and so on. I'll say more about this at the end, on ethnic, racial, and national categories that have been around for quite a long time. New kinds of genealogy are being articulated. New kinds of people are able to become ancestors now as a result of same-sex parenting, sperm donor families, and so on. But keeping genealogical records of such families and keeping track of kinship and all of that has been a practice for thousands of years. And attention to who and what gets memorialized as sort of symbols of our collective ancestry taps into traditions of ancestor veneration that can be found the world over. So the argument that I want to submit to you is that ancestry has an ancestry, that every way we have of knowing where we thinking about where we come from, caring about where we come from, is layered over earlier ones. And by unpeeling those layers, we get a richer sense of why it plays the role in society and politics, and for that matter, science and medicine, that it does today. Now, I want here to just make a little side note, because, you guys are studying global studies. This is a global studies lecture. I'm imagining many of you are from around the world, or are, of course, interested in thinking about connections around the world. And I feel that it's very important here to point out that, while some people may be interested in genealogy, some of you may be interested in genealogy, some people may have access to lots of kinds of documents that help you find out about your ancestors. For the vast majority of people in the world, it is actually very difficult to find documents that tell them, where their great-grandparents were born, or to get the kind of insight that's provided by the things that are available to certain kinds of people who have lived in certain kinds of places with certain kinds of backgrounds. What's more, while, again, I've gone on about how genealogy is super popular and so on, it may well be that, for example, some of you just don't care. That it's not important, that, there are times and places where people don't want to think about the past. They want to think about where they are right now and where they're going in the future. And in fact, in a way, my own interest in this topic comes a bit from a place like that, because, oops, I think I've got this in the wrong order. Okay, here we go. Because my family is exactly the kind of family that, doesn't really have a lot of access historically to rich documentary repositories of, records of where we come from and what our name was and what status we had and all that kind of thing. On one side of my family, I am Bengali Indian. On the other side of my family, I am Ashkenazi Jewish from quite poor, shtetl-dwelling people in the Russian Pale. And these are not people who left behind documents or where the documents survived or anything like that. And my interest, as I say, in this topic actually came in part from a feeling of disconnection that I had when I was doing my archival research for all of the books on the history of the British Empire that Professor Myers told you about that I've written in the past. And I would go into these archives in London or in the US or in Canada. And in the archives, there would be, like 90% of the people using the archives would be probably a good generation and a half or 2 generations older than me. They were overwhelmingly white, and they were there researching their ancestors. And I thought, what is it that these people are doing? I don't even, even if I wanted to do this, I don't have access to that kind of thing. What is going on? And then I realized that I became interested in history in the first place through stories that my global family told me, that one of my grandmothers told me about, growing up in what is now Bangladesh and, making her way through the early years of World War II, starting a family in a city that was being potentially going to be bombed by the Japanese, and then immigrating to the United States. On the other side, a grandmother who was born in Transylvania, yes, where Dracula comes from, and who experienced the fact that she, in a way, kind of moved countries without ever moving to a new place when the region that she was born in switched possession from Austro-Hungarian rule to Romanian rule. And it was through these stories that I developed a curiosity about the past, a curiosity about different parts of the world. And those stories were stories about ancestry. So, I think that the ways that we can access the past come to us in many, many different forms. And the other thing that I came to realize from all of this is that whether or not you care where you came from, it cares about you. Why? Because ancestry affects the legal, the medical, the social position of just about all of us in the world today in ways that I would like to go on to explain. So let me trace out 4 modalities or 4 registers on which ancestry matters for many of us today. And those registers are spiritual, material, political, legal, and biological. These different modalities can very much overlap. I mean, long before the discovery of the gene, for example, people were referring to the idea that qualities could be inherited in the blood, right? Well into the age of genetics that we're in now, people invoke spiritual connections with ancestors. So it's not as though, people used to think about it in a spiritual way and now they think about it in a scientific way. I don't want to argue that at all. All of these things, can coexist. But we can trace a kind of chronology of the advent and spread of technologies for recording ancestry and ways in which they came to take on kind of, institutional and political and cultural significance. And through that, we can trace a sort of, history of ancestry, as it were, that comes to explain how and why ancestry shapes us and has long shaped us, whether we like it or not. So let me begin with what I'm calling the kind of spiritual register on which ancestry matters. And this is one that I think we can really push back all the way back into prehistory, because every society tells a story about where it comes from, a story about how it is created, about where people come from. And typically those stories about where people come from are related to stories about the creation of the universe, the creation of the planet, and so on. They are stories about the ancestry of humanity. They are stories that tend to link the divine with the earthly. Examples of these can be found, as I say, in basically every society. And the only reason I say basically every society as opposed to every society is because I haven't made a study of every single world society, and maybe there's 1 or 2 exceptions, but basically, these creation stories come from everywhere. Take the example of course, the Old Testament, where after making the heavens and the earth, the Hebrew God of the Old Testament fills them with birds and animals and fish, and then formed man of the dust of the ground, and from the man's rib fashions woman. I could give you the example of the Icelandic sagas, where the gods Odin, Vili, and Ve will turn an ash tree and an elm tree, respectively, into man and woman. I can give you the example of the Quiche Maya in the Popol Vuh manuscript, where the gods first try to create people out of clay and they dissolve in the rain, and then they try to create people out of wood, but they're sort of stiff and unfeeling, and then they create people successfully out of ground cornmeal and water. Now, lots of scholarly attention has gone into trying to figure out what origin stories are sort of doing and saying, what function they serve, why they're universal, what are the patterns, the meanings, the values set out in these stories, etc. And I should also add that a good deal of that scholarship, at least in the 19th century, was extremely ethnocentric and basically said, look, this stuff is mythology. It's, what kind of primitive people believe, primitive in scare quotes, as opposed to our scientific understandings today. And so, the study of this kind of subject, again, has preoccupied people interested in anthropology and mythology for a long time. I think for the purposes of understanding what they have to tell us about ancestry, though, they're very significant in one particular way, and that is that they provide a kind of template for how the living, the people in the present, the people who are hearing the story, relate to and conceptualize their relationship with the ancestors and the creators. So origin stories kind of intrinsically set out a pattern of generational change. In fact, one feature that's quite interesting about a lot of them is that you'll find that there's a kind of 3 or 4 generations that separate the creation of the universe by, a creator god of some sort from the creation of human beings who have names. And there's often a few stages, like in the Greeks, you have the Titans who fill in one of those stages. And eventually you get down to, demigods, and then you get down to humans and so on. So that's one thing, that they already kind of within them have a kind of genealogy of sorts laid out. They often include connections between a people, a group of people, and a geographical place. In the case, for instance, of Aboriginal Australians, this invests specific locations on the landscape with sacred significance, and the well-known and studied song lines are kind of routes that Aboriginal Australians can follow through a sacred landscape, where different spots are places where you will venerate specific divinities and specific spirits of ancestors. And this idea of the connection of people to place, I want to just sort of plant for you as an idea, because I think that, in the question of ancestry, it's sort of a through line that we see is that, people coming from a particular place is something that comes up a lot throughout history in invocations of ancestry. And then a third feature of these stories that I think is very significant and that will go on to have very important ramifications is that origin stories about, where humans come from, where people come from, can often license the formation of hierarchies of certain sorts. They single out some lineages from others when, for example, certain lineages are more directly descended from the creators and the gods than others. Just think about how many royal families in world history have claimed descent from some kind of supernatural thing. The Inca emperors, for example, claimed descent from the sun. The Chinese emperors called themselves the sons of heaven. The Egyptian pharaohs styled themselves the sons of Amun-Ra, etc. And I think all of these sorts of spiritual connections, the idea that the people are created from the gods and that there's a genealogy linking them, helps explain why it is that in numerous societies around the world, there is spiritual reverence for the deceased elders and the ancestors of individuals and clans and communities, a process and a practice which we call ancestor veneration, or more sort of sloppily, ancestor worship. The essence of ancestor veneration is that you believe that, here's where I messed up my slides, here we go, is that the ancestors are those dead individuals who are nevertheless able to play an active role in the world of the living. And in fact, this is evident in the very first form of writing that we have from China. which of course invented writing very, very early in its society. So in the Shang dynasty, some like 3,000 years ago, there are archaeological fragments which are called oracle bones. And these are often the bones of cows, like the shoulder blades of cows, or the part of a tortoise shell that comes under the kind of belly of a tortoise. And they would be used in divination rituals in which the king and his diviners would attempt to communicate with the spirits of the ancestors to solve particular problems, or to really predict various things like, will there be good rains this year or not? One set that exists is about whether or not, who is responsible for the emperor's toothache? Is it ancestor so-and-so, or is it ancestor so-and-so else? And then once you figure this out, you can perform the relevant rites to placate that ancestor in order to make the toothache go away, or in order to make the harvest a good one, or in order to help you win a battle over your enemies, and so on. And so this idea that the ancestors can play a role in the life of the living means that the living need to do things in order to keep the ancestors happy, in order to bring things to themselves. So in various West African and diasporic West African traditions, for example, you might want to placate the ancestors to prevent bad stuff from happening to you. In the case of Chinese ancestor veneration traditions, you might want to, sort of console them in order to bring to yourself material rewards. In the case of ancient Rome, for instance, from which, by the way, a lot of Western ongoing sort of modern practices with respect to, well, all kinds of things descend, but I think most particularly our example, people would keep shrines with ancestors in their households in order to bring blessings to the house. Now, a key point in all of this, which was illustrated by a raft of 20th century anthropological studies on ancestor veneration around the world, is that not every dead person in your background necessarily counts as an ancestor. What do I mean by that? Well, only some figures are singled out as having this kind of power in the realm of the living. Ancestors, to put it more bluntly, ancestors are made. Ancestors are made. You kind of pick them out of your lineage as the ones who are going to be significant, the ones to whom you might have a tablet in your ancestral hall, the ones that you might invoke in particular religious rites, etc. And what this means in turn is that ancestors have to be made through various practices, typically through different rites, beginning with the various funerary rites, and then persisting over different things down through time, usually conducted by children. And often this can be incredibly gendered in quite important ways. It helps account for why it's so important in certain cultures to have a son, so that the son can go on and perform certain rites. In other societies, you'll find that women play a role in certain aspects of maintaining household shrines and so on. Anyway, the practices of ancestor veneration embed within them all kinds of things about social hierarchies. And when you single out parts of your genealogy as being special and important, there is a kind of corollary. And that corollary is that you want to be able to keep track of which ancestors mattered and how. Here's just a quick illustration from ancient Rome, which is that in ancient Rome, if you were from a high status family, a patrician family, then you might make a point of mounting funeral masks of your deceased forebears as a way of showing status, as a way of kind of showing off, I'm descended from these people. And in fact, the word image in English today comes from the Latin word for these funerary masks. So, in a certain way, the presentation of these masks you could think of as the first kind of beginnings of keeping track of a kind of visual lineage that will lead in the course of what I'll explain in the next few minutes to the very well-known graphics of the family tree that we're familiar with today. So this brings me to another kind of major dimension or modality of the study of the significance of ancestry. So there's a spiritual piece of it, and there's also a very kind of material piece to it. Ancestry matters for the allocation of power within a society. Who has political power, who has power within a family, male or female or which generation or that kind of thing. It can organize rules about who gets to marry whom, and by extension, who gets to have children with whom and become ancestors. And of course, it also matters very much for the rules of inheritance of material property. And we see all of this, this kind of material dimension of ancestry, I think helps account for the, again, near universal practice of the recording of genealogies, the keeping records of who descends from whom, particularly in families which do have some property, families which do have some power, so that they can figure out how to pass it on and to whom. Now, genealogies come in all kinds. There are oral genealogies, which accomplish certain things. You can find these, for example, in the West African tradition of griot, or kind of praise singers. They will sing genealogies, and in the course of these, they're able to kind of fold in accounts of creation and a people's origins with very specific genealogies, and they're able to kind of create a community of belonging among the listeners of these songs. You can find written genealogies, which create chronological lineages and figure in some of the oldest world literature, for which I'll give you an important case in point, namely the Bible, which is really crammed with genealogies, as some of you may have noticed. Right here in the book of Genesis, we've got genealogy. It's here's the creation of Adam and Eve, and then what do we have? We have the begat, the begat, the begat, the begat, the begat, the begat, the begat. And in fact, these begats and the number of years ascribed to each of these individuals was used by Christian scholars in the early modern period to try to date the creation of the earth, because they could kind of add up all the generations and say, yes, it was 6,000 years ago that this happened. And then this takes on further significance when you start heading into the later chapters and books of the Bible. So specifically, the figure of Abraham becomes an important patriarch. Abraham becomes the patriarch of the Jews. He is the progenitor of the Jewish people, the tribes of Israel, etc. And more than that, when you move into the New Testament, you find that Abraham is also quite directly named as one of the progenitors of the adoptive father of Jesus Christ, Joseph. And I find this quite, worth our time to just pay attention to, which is that Jesus, his genealogy is, of course, son of God, right, through his mother. But on the paternal side, on the earthly paternal side, the people who were responsible for the collation of the books of the New Testament were very interested in trying to give to Jesus this sort of sanctified, ennobled type of lineage by tracing it back to Abraham. And wait, there's even more, because when you go to Islamic texts, you find that Abraham is also a progenitor of Islam, an ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad. So it is for this reason that the tomb of the patriarchs, the site of, the burial site of Abraham is contested across multiple religions, and is also extremely holy across multiple religions. And it's a great example of the importance of recording genealogy in a whole bunch of different faith traditions that would then be, echoed in secular contexts and in non-royal and non-aristocratic contexts as well. Now, it's out of this biblical tradition that another genre of genealogy takes shape, one that will end up being extremely flexible and adaptable. And that is, I've mentioned oral genealogies, I've mentioned written genealogies, but there are also, of course, visual genealogies. And it is from the descriptions of verses of the Bible that there emerges this visualization of the lineage of Jesus. It's called the Tree of Jesse. And again, it comes from a biblical verse. I don't have it to the tip of my tongue, though some of you may be familiar with it. And beginning in the Middle Ages in Western Europe, you see illustrations that show this kind of branch emanating from the figure of Jesse leading to Jesus. And one of the things that I want to highlight about this is that, whereas the oral genealogies are able to create a kind of community of belonging among listeners who are all, hearing the genealogy at the same moment in time, whereas written genealogies are able to create lists, basically, and provide a chronology. What the visual genealogy can do is both, because what it can do is you can choose to have it go forward or backward. You guys will have doubtless seen, trees where there's a, figure at the top and everything coming down, or a figure at the bottom and everything going up. You can read them across time. You can expand them horizontally. You can fold in people in different ways. You can cut and prune the branches. The possibilities are very, very rich in the visualization of the genealogy through the form of the family tree. And it is very quickly kind of taken up in all kinds of cultures, or other cultures also sort of come up with this kind of visualization because it is so flexible. It is really one of the great kind of data visualizations of human culture, this way of recording genealogies. And you will find this type of imagery in all over the world. I mean, I put two right here, one from the Ottoman domains, another from India. Just the other day, I saw another one which was showing the community of descent from Hasidic rabbis. I mean, you see it all over the place. Now, why do you want these genealogies, these family trees, etc.? Well, you want them typically because you want to try to record status. I'll stick with that. You want to record status. You want to figure out who has power, who gets to transmit it, property, etc., and who doesn't, right? Because there's a lot of things that are left out of this. Just the very fact of male dominance in many traditions, for instance, is a very good example of this. When people have multiple spouses and children through multiple partners, those are often left off, etc. So, very selective reckoning, and one that is used for very material purposes. Once you acknowledge that ancestors can confer status, or the lack of ancestors can deny status, there are plenty of reasons why you could imagine that individuals and families might want to keep track of it. But so increasingly do governments and states and institutions. And this brings me to the third modality that I want to talk about, namely the political and legal realms in which ancestry has significance in all of our lives. In the kind of early modern period, into the modern period, states take on the responsibility increasingly for documenting some of the kinds of things that either weren't documented at all before, or that maybe religious institutions kept, or that were kept in sort of ad hoc and local ways. These would include, for instance, records of birth and marriage and death. And they would include some of the documents which are used in the legal realm to manage inheritance of property being a very obvious one, and to certify descent, like a birth certificate. One of the things that's kind of interesting about these records is that, they're created sometimes for certain purposes in the moment in which they're created, but they go on also to have these afterlives in the form of, say, being great records for genealogical research, which people continue to use for purposes of ancestry. A great example of the kind of document that is made sort of for one kind of purpose and used for another are censuses, which are kept by modern states in increasingly regular ways, beginning in the later 18th century, and have become pretty standard as something that modern states like to do, to keep track of everybody who's living in a nation in a particular time, who they're living with, who they're related to, and so on. And what this highlights, I think, is that these kinds of documents become important on a scale that ranges beyond the family or the village or the religious community or something like that. They become important for establishing membership in political communities, and increasingly political communities that we call nations. In the decades, well, really, from the later 18th century onward, and I can sort of talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like, but I would say that, you see this happening with increasing kind of acceleration and scale around the world in the later 19th century. People increasingly are kind of required to carry documents that show things about who they are, identity documents. And those identity documents often have some, statements about their ancestry. Who are they? Who was their father? Who was their mother? Where are they from in the loose, but also quite precise geographical sense? Because what ends up happening is this question of where you come from, who you are descended from, can have incredible significance for whether or not you can belong as a citizen to a particular state. How does this work? Well, citizenship, down to the present day, tends to be granted on the basis of one or both of two principles. We get the principles, the names of the principles from Latin, and they are jus soli and jus sanguinis. And those of you who know your Latin may know soli, well, jus is law, J-U-S, law, and soli, the ground, the earth, the soil. Sanguinis is the blood. So what does this mean? Well, it means that in some societies, you can become a citizen, you are considered a citizen when you are descended from a person who is already a citizen, that is jus sanguinis, by blood. In others, you become a citizen because you're born in the place of which you're a citizen, jus soli, by virtue of the place of birth. So that one is less pegged to, your kind of your specific, father, mother, etc. It's based on the place of birth. But the jus sanguinis grants political rights on the basis of what your parents had before you. And this notion really hinges on an idea which is articulated in the kind of in the Enlightenment period in Europe, at least, by various figures, perhaps most famously this German named Herder, who influentially associates the concept of the nation as a political community with the idea of a kind of collective ancestry. And these words that he uses are so interesting, right? The ancient characters of nations arose from the family traits, from the early transactions, and the deeds peculiar to them. The customs of the father took deep root and became internal prototypes of the race. What does this mean? Well, it means that the right ancestry, that is, ancestry from the people who are already, citizens of this community, gives you citizenship. And it's layered over a broader way in which the right ancestry comes to spell, as I've suggested, comes to spell belonging in societies. Now, I just want to flick back quickly to the previous image, because you may have noticed something about this map. If I can go back, there we go. You may have noticed something about this map. Now, the pink territories are the ones which currently today grant citizenship on the basis of jus soli. And the brown territories are the ones that grant it on the basis of jus sanguinis. Incidentally, we also use the term birthright citizenship to describe this phenomenon. And then you'll notice that there's a bunch of countries in Western Europe which do both. This is a relatively new development historically. And you'll notice a big thing, right, which is that the settler colonial societies of the Americas are overwhelmingly societies that grant citizenship on the basis of the location of birth, not on the citizenship of the parents as such. I mean, they actually do both. If you're born to Americans abroad, you're also an American citizen, et cetera. But in any case, why might that be? Well, when you're in a settler and immigrant society, then obviously this idea that your ancestors were born in the same place and thus citizens of the place already, it didn't fly, in 1750. It didn't even fly in 1790 after American independence, when still actually a very large number of people living in the colonies had been born outside the colonies, either in Europe or, of course, in the case of the enslaved population in Africa. At that time, incidentally, Native American peoples were considered separate nations and had their own, were considered citizens of separate indigenously sovereign nations. So how does this work in immigrant societies? It might look like, oh, wow, these are societies where your ancestry doesn't matter. You get rights anyway. Sorry, that's not entirely the case. How do we know that? Well, take the case of what is popularly called, and the word that's around in the news even today, nativism in the US. What you end up finding in American historical practice going into the 19th century is that even though in principle an immigrant can become a citizen of the United States, this takes on a twist with the rise of mass immigration from non-Anglo-Saxon and non-Protestant countries in the later 19th century. You can essentially track the rise of immigration to the United States in the rise of so-called lineage societies. These are organizations that are founded to celebrate the connections of individuals in the present to distinguished ancestors in the past. Sons of the American Revolution, Mayflower Descendants Society, sons of the Cincinnati dates further back to the 18th century, United Daughters of the Confederacy, et cetera. What's going on here? All of these societies are establishing sort of, I'm better than you kinds of claims. They're basically clubs for membership that are only allowing in people who had, ancestors who were able to come to the colonies at a time when, guess who wasn't coming to the colonies? Large numbers of Italians, large numbers of Irish, large numbers of Jews, large numbers of Chinese, et cetera, right? So they're a way of setting up sort of social hierarchies. And this in turn is related to much more sort of formalized and legalized forms of exclusion that will take shape in anti-immigration legislation, such as Chinese exclusion acts in the later 19th century. So, once you say that ancestry doesn't really matter for citizenship, i.e. you can be a citizen if you're born in the country, well, guess what? There's a new way that ancestry will matter for citizenship, which is that you're going to be kept out at the border and not allowed to come in. By the way, this business about the lineage organizations is not unique to the United States. You find other kinds of organizations of this sort taking shape in other countries, but I'll just point to one in Canada, which dates from also, well, in this case, the early 20th century, and in Brazil, where there's a quite active community of descendants of Confederates who emigrated to Brazil in the wake of the Civil War. So, you may have noticed a word in Herder's discussion, and this is one that I want to use to sort of wrap up this issue of the political and legal ramifications of ancestry. That word was race. Race can be used and has been used in many contexts in ways that overlap very closely with ancestry. And even in popular parlance today, you will hear this done. In the 18th century, another German intellectual, proposed that the human species, humankind, the human race, if I could so use that phrase, came in a variety of different forms, which originated in different parts of the world. Remember that point I made about how ancestry and geographical place often are linked together. He posited, 5 different groups, which I've listed here, one of which you may recognize as still being in pretty widespread use today, namely Caucasian. What is this? Well, the Caucasus are the mountainous region, kind of on the edge of Europe and Asia in the former Soviet Union. And the idea was that fair-skinned people came from the Caucasus and then spread around. And now when people use this word Caucasian as a synonym for white, they are actually tapping into this highly racist kind of language dating back to the 18th century. And so, the different categories have changed over time that anthropologists used, et cetera, but this kind of terminology sticks around. And this idea that certain peoples come from certain places and that it kind of, their ancestry links them to certain places and it gives them different rights will find its way into American law in important ways. Sorry, I have that slide double. But it comes up in a number of Supreme Court cases in the early 20th century, which are basically tests of the proposition that people born outside the United States can become citizens if they fulfill certain kinds of criteria. Under the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution after the Civil War, everyone born in the US gets citizenship. However, I see somebody gets to write on this, that's kind of cool. However, only people who are categorized as free white persons are allowed to naturalize as citizens of the United States. And so this is tested by a number of Asian immigrants in the early 20th century. And I won't get into all the details, but I do want to just highlight one case for you here, which is the case of this fellow here called Bhagat Singh Thind. He was a World War I veteran. He had lived in the United States for some time, and he ended up trying to naturalize, and it went through the courts and on, and it ended up making its way up through the court system on the question of whether or not this particular individual, who, as he described in his papers, was a high caste Hindu from India, whether he counted as a white person for the purposes of naturalization. How did he argue the case? Well, he said, sorry, I'll back up. He argued it saying, I come from India. India is a place which we know to be Aryan because, in ancient times, the same groups of people populated Western Europe as populated India. And we know this because of the, linguistic similarities, et cetera, et cetera. And that means, he said, that I'm a Caucasian. And because I'm a Caucasian, it means that I'm white. So this goes up to the Supreme Court, and here's what they say. They say, hey, just because you can claim that you're Caucasian and show indeed that you're Caucasian, it actually doesn't mean that you're the same as white. And so therefore, unfortunately, we're going to decide that the racial difference is, too much, and so you're not going to get to count, and so no, you don't get to be a citizen. So look, this is a big and complex area, but I wanted to just highlight this because, as I say, I think in our popular discourse today, race and ancestry, continue to be somewhat sort of overlapping terms, and when this becomes the arbiter of whether or not you have certain political and legal rights, this is an incredibly consequential aspect of ancestry in history and even down into the present. I'd like to conclude with a fourth modality for how ancestry matters to humans now and in the past. And that modality is also connected to this issue of race. That modality is biological. Again, the notion that ancestry has a biological component, that you are the child of your parents, right? It's a very biological relationship. Long predates the advent of genetics in the early 20th century. But the emergence of genetics as a field of study, the identification of the gene as the biological quantum of inheritance, will radically transform the relationship between biology and ancestry in all kinds of arenas. Because what genetics makes it possible to do is to zoom in on the heritability of specific traits and to give rise to a whole new way of thinking about how to manage inheritance. The genetics are kind of identified, famously by this Czech monk working away in his garden in Brno in the Czech Republic, I think it's the Czech Republic, or is it Slovakia, in the later 19th century, kind of 1870s and on. It's really only kind of taken up by the wider scientific community in the early 1900s and popularized, and very quickly the advent of genetics, including incidentally the term gene and genetics, starts to influence policymaking in important ways, notably through the concept of eugenics. Eugenics is a neologism coined by an English scientist and also incidentally a first cousin of Charles Darwin called Francis Galton. And the idea is the U for good and the gen for this quantum of inheritance means good, good inheritance. The aim of eugenics is to try to create a better population. It can be done in a couple ways, they say. You can either do it through so-called positive eugenics, that is, you encourage people who have good attributes to get together and have children, or it can be done through negative eugenics, namely you sterilize people who you consider to be unfit. You keep them out at the border and you don't let them immigrate. You don't let them marry. You strip them of rights of various kinds. And it is, in fact, from American eugenic practice that the notion of labeling entire populations as unfit, quote unquote, or undesirable, quote unquote, will take hold in the legal cultures and policies of the Nazi regime in Germany, which passes legislation on a bigger scale than had ever been seen before, attempting to regulate the management, really, of entire populations on the basis of their ancestry. I put this because I just want to note that eugenics was unbelievably popular and widespread. And in fact, it was unbelievably popular and widespread among people who considered themselves in the early 20th century to be liberal and progressive and intellectual. It was seen as the kind of scientific way, the modern way, the progressive way to try to move forward in society. All kinds of people subscribed to it. Some of the things that are offshoots from it today will include some of the kinds of, the organization of Planned Parenthood, for instance, issues of reproductive rights. Other offshoots include, to some extent, the widespread adoption of intelligence testing. All kinds of people were involved in this. It was a big international thing. And guess what they adopted as their logo for their big international conferences? The tree that is such a kind of potent image of ancestry, descent, and origins. So it is the Nazis who really kind of escalate this to a whole other level. And one thing that I want to signal here is that in the modern era, things about ancestry basically translate into things about documents. And in the Third Reich, in order to prove that you conformed to the severe Nazi racial laws that basically prescribed anyone of Jewish descent and also Roma descent and so on from holding different positions, you had to carry around documents that proved that you were, anywhere from 3 to 6 generations pure Aryan. And the result of this is the Germans started carrying around so-called ancestry passports that demonstrated their purity of descent. So, this can obviously spark lots of conversation, and I'd like to leave time for that. So I'm going to just kind of end on this particular note with a couple of wrap-up thoughts. First, to say that I really doubt that most of the kids who are doing family tree assignments in school these days, and many of you may have done them or may be doing them now, are aware of the fact that family tree assignments, so to speak, were kind of part and parcel of what Germans were doing in the Third Reich. So there's kind of interesting and perhaps quite problematic histories involved in some of these practices, alongside many other ways in which they've registered. But I just want to kind of wrap up with the biology to say that I think that I've tried to argue that there are these sedimented layers in the ancestry of ancestry that involve religion, status, material status, citizenship, and more. And the latest layer that I would posit is what we call identity. And I just did a little kind of search here. I shouldn't say maybe the latest layer, the latest kind of frame through which people are understanding ancestry is through the frame of identity. And you can see that this is a term that really kind of surges into use and prominence in the last generation or so. Biology has gone on to inflect all of the different kinds of dimensions that I've talked about in this evening's talk. Our origin story about where humanity comes from has been transformed due to research using ancient DNA. We now have a much kind of deeper picture of the population history of humanity. Even in biology, ancestors are invented, so to speak. That is, if you look at your own genotype, you will find that you only inherit DNA from a subsection of your ancestors. So in much the way that we pick them out on a family tree or something like that, similarly, genetically, you do not carry genetic traces of every single person who came before you, but only some of them. And the role of genealogies and the state remains, the intersection of genealogies and the state remains very strong in the realm of and the era of genetic tests, because how are these results reported out when you take a genetic test? They're often reported out in relation to much more modern categories of nationality, such as British and Irish, French and German and so on, that are themselves geopolitical constructions. So, one of the great hopes of the genetic era has been that we will all find out how mixed we are if we take these tests, how mixed up we all are. And there's no such thing as purity. We all have a bit of this, a bit of that. We're all related. We're all descended from everyone. And the hope from that is that tolerance globally will increase. I am not quite so sanguine about that. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. I would. In our era, it's also quite obvious that the possibilities of ancestry to divide people remain as robust as ever. And that one of the consequences of ancestry having an ancestry is that it is itself a kind of ongoing, fixation that can be applied and reinvented in a variety of circumstances. And so I'm actually quite nervous about ancestry continuing to matter politically, legally, religiously, and so on, in an era when we have more powerful tools than ever to attach ancestry to biology and try to essentialize it. And so, my own hope would be for us to be able to get better at creating communities in which ancestry actually doesn't determine whether or not you get rights. You should get rights anyway. It doesn't determine your status. You should get, sort of an equal playing field no matter what. And I hope that we can move toward a society in which the ancestry that we do all share somewhere back there, as we're all mixed up, will overcome the kinds of ancestry that are invoked by some to claim privileges over others. And through that, I hope that all of us will become better ancestors to future generations. Thank you for hearing me out, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Jasanoff. That was fantastic. I have two questions in the chat, and if that's it, then we'll move on to audible questions. So the first is from Gary Ostrower, who's a history professor here. What about revolutionary movements that often implicitly, sometimes explicitly reject the past? He's thinking of the French in 1791 creating a new revolutionary calendar. Do these revolutionary societies view the subject of ancestry and the influence of ancestry different from more traditional societies?
So the answer, of course, is yes, they do. But the other answer to that is that they usually fail. So, I've been trying to think about societies in which ancestry doesn't matter. Of course, the French Revolution attempts to do this, and it doesn't work. The United States obviously attempts to break away from it. Does, fights a revolution like the French, designed to break away from monarchical and aristocratic rule. And then what do? They reinvent their own. The Sons of the Society of the Cincinnati are a good early example of that. But those lineage societies I was pointing to are another example of that. France obviously ends up reinstating the monarchy. Another more recent example would be the Cultural Revolution in China, in which there was mass destruction of ancestral shrines, lineage halls, etc. However, there is evidence that ancestor veneration practices continue and potentially have ticked up in the post-Maoist era, and one could argue that rights and belonging within Communist Party families in China today obviously convey different sorts of privileges.
My question, if I get to ask it, is circling back around to communist China, Maoist China, so I'll come back to that. Just a comment from Steve Pilgrim. Thank you on behalf of my great-grandmother who passed away, or passed as white 120 years ago, and all of my historical relatives whose contributions would have been buried or overlooked. My German ancestors reinvented themselves as Scots-Irish after World War I, aspirational ethnicity. And so that's all we have in the chat. I'll move over to, I see a few hands. First one up was Megan.
Hi, Dr. Jasanoff, and I will out myself as Andrew's wife here. I'm crashing the party from Rochester Institute of Technology. I do immigration work with international students there. Thank you for this talk. This has just been really enjoyable and fascinating. And I have a question by way of an example. In my work, I help provide ways for international students to come to the US. And I had an interesting case a year or so ago of a student originally from Syria who wanted to come and spend a year doing his study abroad at our institution. Well, of course, there were some travel bans in place at the time under the previous administration where I had to say, I can't help you. There's nothing I can do for you. Several months passed, I don't recall the exact amount of time, and he popped back up with a new passport, St. Kitts and Nevis. And as you're likely aware, you're able to, in so many words,
Megan, you're muted.
But I lost Megan there.
You're muted, so just go back a few sentences.
Oh, sorry, I slide. Oh, so
yeah.
So purchasing citizenship, a certain level of economic investment in the country, voila, you've got a new passport. And I think that's especially an interesting kind of juxtaposition. Syria, where this student was under a travel ban for what many understand is sort of on a racist premise, that sense of belonging. And now in such a modern way, now you have, it's not really a new ancestry, but new rights that can kind of work around that. And I'm wondering your thoughts. Is there anything in that to suggest that the idea that people coming from certain places and that mattering, is this an example of that dying? And what does this look like in a new, where economics is a new layer?
Yeah, no, that's a great question and point. I mean, I think what I'd say is that political community and ancestry are not coterminous, but they do overlap. And in a way, the controversy around the travel ban exemplified that, right? I mean, legally, it was framed as, we're blocking people from a particular nation, but of course it was understood to have some kind of broader ethnic kind of, undertones within it. I would say though that, I mean, so yeah, they're coterminous, but they don't overlap. I would counter to the St. Kitts thing, for example, the purchasing of citizenship. I would say, first of all, what is it that gives the student the resources to be able to purchase that citizenship? So that's an important thing. Another one would be, of course, the many societies that are now granting citizenship to descendants of people who were stripped of it earlier, right? So Germany, Spain, there are many countries which are attempting to attract, ultimately, I think, investment by granting citizenship to people who are, in a diaspora. So I don't think it's coming to an end. And I think that it is clear that more and more countries are granting solely birthright citizenship, but the ability now maybe to acquire multiple passports is something that will depend on your ancestry.
Thank you.
Taylor Jetsko, do you want to answer?
Perfect. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you.
Perfect. So thank you so much. It was a privilege to hear you speak here. Let me turn my camera on. So as you alluded to in your talk, death is an important aspect in studying and discussing ancestry. And we know that various global cultures have vastly different sensitivities when it comes to discussing death and the dead. So I'm wondering if you've experienced any difficulties throughout your research in gaining perspectives from different groups, and if so, could you speak on that?
I'm very reliant in this on, the immense literature that's being done by anthropologists on issues of ancestor veneration. I mean, I think that it's possible to learn about I'd say that there's something a little bit like the answer that I gave to the previous question, which is that ancestry and practices surrounding death are not coterminous, but they overlap. That is, in societies in which you're singling out particular ancestors for veneration, you're doing a particular set of things around the dead that will have significance in the generations going forward. There may be aspects of those rituals, for example, that remain very private and undiscussed, but the fact of the process, is still sort of there and is kind of perceptible on a kind of society-wide scale. I mean, one thing that your question does make me think of, though, is that, I think that it's important to acknowledge that, there are many people who, and this actually touches on the point that was made in the chat about the, the aspirational ethnicity. There are many people who wish to conceal their backgrounds, don't want to talk about them, have traumatic ancestral pasts, or wish to reinvent themselves in various ways. And so this is where even in this, it's on in that society, it remains a constitutive part of the society, whether or not people want to kind of talk about it, So yeah, I mean, I think that what I have seen for much more sensitive practices with respect to, for example, the disinterment of human remains in different parts of the world, or the repatriation of human remains, et cetera, precisely because they have spiritual significance in certain cultures that they've been sort of forcibly removed from through colonialism and so on.
Thank you, Taylor. Johnny, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you for coming. So I'm running a bit late, but so I wanted to kind of ask a follow-up question on, you were saying that you have concerns that the increase of like the fact that kind of genetics is more readily available, it's concerning to you because people can use it as kind of evidence, or use it much more easily to kind of show, I guess, their supremacy. I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on on the increased kind of percentage of the population who are more than one race? I'm asking this because my mom is Indonesian and I'm American and my dad is white. And so I just wanted to ask, what your thoughts on that. Is that more concerning or less concerning? Does it, do you see it as a good thing, or do you see it as people will use that as evidence of kind of like, well, later have kind of a sense of supremacy for like being pure? I just wanted to ask what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, so what I would say is that, well, okay, I have a big point and a small point. The small point is about the point that you make about, the most recent census showing this higher percentage in particular of people who identify as Latino or Latina. Why? Well, because basically they changed the category. I mean, in part, they changed the checkboxes on the census. So, one of the things that I just want to point out here is that even our understanding of who counts as what is a product of, political and social and historical forces. Did those people just suddenly now start to identify themselves in that way? No, we suddenly developed, the government suddenly developed a measure that could capture that. So that's a small thing. However, yes, I mean, it is a fact that, I mean, we can certainly see this, around the world, that there is more intermarriage and people are moving globally on a much larger scale. And it is for that reason that people are hopeful about a future in which, supremacy and exclusionary politics will subside. I just don't see the evidence for that. I mean, I guess I would say that, what we can see historically is that racism and exclusionary politics have a great way of reinventing themselves for different moments of different arenas. And, you can go to a society that might appear to, let's say, an American, where we do have a quite multicultural society, that looks by contrast very monocultural, and you'll find them finding ways to differentiate each other. So, the tendency, I mean, I think this gets into some bigger philosophical question about, is the tendency to divide greater than the tendency to unite, et cetera, et cetera. But what is unmistakable is that we have a new tool, and that new tool is the genetic test. And when you start to believe that the power to define who's who, is embodied, is literally kind of embodied in the genes, and you already have all of these ways in which ancestry matters for your rights, I think that that's a thing we need to, that's worrisome and that needs our attention.
Thank you.
Art history professor Hope Childers has a question.
Hello, thank you everybody and Dr. Jasanoff for a great conversation. And so my question is just a little bit selfish, and some people will recognize this. I'm teaching in spring a new class that I'm preparing called Landscape Across Cultures. And so I was particularly interested to hear the points you made here and there about the connection between ancestry and geography. And you mentioned the song lines in Australia. And of course, we have the phenomenon of the Native American communities and their attachments to different part of the land. I'm also interested in like those communities who have asserted personhood of geographical, geological entities and so on for the landscape class. And so I was wondering if we've seen a reassertion of those kinds of connections. Like now it's becoming more commonplace to say we are on the land of the Seneca, et cetera, and so on. I think Australian communities, Indigenous, have also done some similar efforts. Do you see this, and in conjunction with things like the DNA testing, 23andMe, which I've also done, where suddenly many of us are discovering that we are actually from everywhere, from all the land in some ways, like our attachment is somehow scattered all of a sudden. Like, are any of these leaning towards a disconnect between the connection of ancestry with land or landscape? Do you see any of this as an the beginnings of an emerging challenge to, for instance, this might sound optimistic, the nation state or anything like that? I mean, so I'm really interested in pursuing ideas about ancestry and land for my class. So if you have any thoughts on that, that would be great. Thank you.
I mean, I'll tell you the first thing that comes to mind when you spoke is, of course, the erasure of certain populations from land, which, is relevant, obviously, in the case of native peoples in so much of the United States and North America in general, and other settler colonial societies. And so, I think that one thing that I would just say is that, at what point in time do people wish to claim their ancestral connection to a place, right? I mean, even when you take the genetic test, it's giving you a snapshot of your ancestry going back about 6 generations, right? It doesn't really go much further. So, at some point back there, quote unquote, we all come from Africa, right? So I feel like this is something that has to be kind of understood in some sort of chronological frame. And I think that it is in the interests of certainly settler colonial nations to start the timing, start the clock, with the arrival of the settler colonialists. So anyway, I guess that's just a thought. The other thing I guess I would say is, and I feel like I'm sort of saying this in many different flavors in response to many questions, but I would just say that yes, I mean, clearly there are ways in which for many people, these tests have been revealing of connections that they didn't know they had, and that make them, curious to visit. Just think about the commercialization of all of this. Airbnb partnered with 23andMe to create these tours, right? It's a big business. There's just a lot of stuff out there that's trying to get you to want to travel to these places. Well, who are the people who are traveling to these places? People with passports where they don't need visas to go to those places, right? People who have the money to buy the tickets, et cetera. So, I mean, I just think that there's a huge amount of sort of unevenness in the people for whom this can end up being somehow expanding. And that all of those kinds of expansion, again, personally significant though they are, and I think, I also want to note that, for people who don't have access to documents, this can be really empowering. I mean, my colleague Henry Louis Gates, has done really important work with African American genealogies, opening up a path to people who had their ancestry stripped from them forcibly, right? So this can be very important. However, I think that it does sit in in this case, a kind of capitalist and geopolitical structure that also, continues to be involved in the dispossession of certain kinds of populations and the erasure of their ancestral ties to place.
Thank you. Louis Johnson, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm working in the same department as Hope. It's a strange coincidence, but I guess my question goes in a similar kind of direction. I mean, I kept on being struck by the issue of the difference between descent and ancestry, and how you secure the difference somehow. And I wondered how significant the territorial thing was in the more kind of ancient perspective. But I guess also I kept on getting a kind of Foucauldian moment where I was thinking of the plague and the regulation around the plague in the 17th century in the modern state, and whether genetics is a kind of version of that. So that's kind of half a question, but I kept on thinking of this recent case of a kind of archaeological conundrum in Turkey, where I'm based when I'm not at Alfred as the visiting chair, as I am this semester, and Göbekli Tepe, or Belly Hill, it's known as. I don't know if you know this particular. A beautiful kind of temples-like space, which the German archaeologist who initially uncovered the site, I believe was called Schmidt. If I get his name wrong, I do apologize, but he was convinced that these fantastic kind of like T-stone structures with beautiful animal carvings on marked particular graves. So he dug down in search of the ancestors and couldn't find them. So up on the hill, kind of like this very early Neolithic site. As I said, I don't know if you know about it, but they're looking for ancestors and they can't kind of find them, or they can't find the remains. I mean, there's some kinds of indication that they might have found something, but it looks as if these are graves, but incorporated into a kind of temple structure without a city. I mean, this is the thing that Schmidt kind of stressed, that it was the kind of temple-like space before the city. But I wonder whether they, I mean, it's as if there's an ancient society without ancestors or without a kind of decoding of ancestors. So that sounds like a kind of overcoding, doesn't it? I mean, it's like the ancestor is overcoded as such. And it sounds like it comes back in your account of the, you know, the tree of descent, which can be pruned in various kinds of ways. But
so I'm not quite sure I follow the thing about the archaeological site, but that's interesting. Is it that archaeologists found the site and assumed that it was related to ancestor veneration, but then found that there were no bodies in it?
that's right, yeah.
And so they're now they're surmising. I mean,
They're still looking, I guess.
but how does that mean? I mean, doesn't that tell us something about the set of assumptions in the minds of the archaeologists,
Yes,
right?
I think.
Yes, I mean, definitely, yes, it does do that. And I mean, yeah, I think that this point you raise about ancestry versus descent is incredibly important. And I think I need to, you know, be more sort of rigorous about how I see the difference. I think that, I mean, at the moment, I would just say that I do think that there's, the way that I would think about it and the two of them as being related is that there is a connection between a transgenerational connections is the thrust of it, right? And you can either be standing in a present moment and looking backwards, or you can be standing in a backwards moment looking forward. I am certainly much more interested in the present moment looking backwards. I wouldn't want to, you know, fall into the problem of saying, you know, these people are talking about their ancestors when they're not. But is that what's happening? I mean, I think when we have so take the biblical genealogies, right? So clearly those are created in a particular moment in order to serve particular political ends in that moment. The actual genealogy that they produce, I mean, who knows if that's accurate or not? I mean, that's a whole other story. But what is clear is that in that moment that they're producing that thing, the concept of ancestry and the concept of having a particular line of descent is incredibly politically significant. So I think that's the frame in which I would look at it.
Sure. No, it's not. It's just a very uncanny thing because they can't quite find the remains of the ancestors that they sort of have to be there in some way in order to authorize this as a kind of recurrent society. I mean, it's the site of the first cultivation of wheat, in fact.
Sorry, this is Ulan Tepe, is it called? What's it called again?
Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, okay.
Belly Hill, it translates into English, but it's at least 7,500 years old. I think even older than that, in fact. So I forget. I'm not an early historian, so there. But
anyway, obviously they need to start doing some DNA sequencing, and you know.
I think they're really trying. Yeah, they're really trying. Anyway, I'll let you go. Thanks for a great talk.
We've got one more question, and it's 8:06, so it's just about time to wrap up. So we'll maybe end on this. This is from Shepard, who's a history major. What are your thoughts on the phenomena occurring wherein descendants of people who lost their cultures or assimilated to a culture for survival are now adopting or appropriating cultures not their own? So he's thinking of Caucasian Americans attempting to do Native American spiritualism, and just my own research, thinking of Jewish Poles who had to kind of eject that culture and then are refinding it, descendants later in modern day Poland, and kind of refinding their Jewish culture.
So sorry, the question, I didn't see it typed, so I was trying.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, so it's from Miguel.
About, oh, there it is. Okay, it's about rediscovering things. I mean, I guess I would just want to kind of underline that phrase, culture's not their own. I mean, that is, what do we mean by that? Isn't that implying, I'll just flag that. I think, you know, everyone in the audience can sort of, you know, ponder that a little bit. You know, what do we consider, who do we consider to be the owners of a particular culture? And I would say that, you know, we all have sort of colloquial understandings of, you know, so and so, to take a personal example, my mother wears a sari, she's from India. If I saw, British colleague of Anglo-Saxon.
Dr. Jasanoff, can you hear us? Is this just me?
Not just you.
Okay.
She's frozen.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
I'm still here.
Oh my, I'm sorry about that.
Yeah,
I don't know what happened.
You left on English colleague wearing a sari.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, I was just going to say that I'm uncomfortable about the idea that certain things belong kind of through time immemorial to certain people. That said, so that's why I would just flag that question of their own. Again, I would say that, with this, we need to think about the power dynamics in play and the sensitivities in play. And there's obviously a lot of a big difference between, people who have traditionally seen their, let's say their land or their cultural traditions or whatever sort of hijacked and usurped, seeing people laying claim to it, and people who have historically been the sort of beneficiaries of a bunch of things, then laying claim to things. I'll cite for your, as an example, a lot of the advertising that's used for Ancestry.com or 23andMe, you'll frequently find these phrases. They'll test people of different phenotypes, and the people who present as white will say things like, oh, I'm disappointed I didn't discover anything cool, I'm just white. And that coding that such and such, that being non-white is cool. Well, it's cool for that person, who presents as white, but it's a very different thing. So I think that this is really has to be sort of thought about on a quite local level about sort of who has the power to do what. But I would say that I am also extremely sort of troubled by the idea that certain populations kind of get, as I said already, get to claim through time immemorial particular things, because that is in its way a version of the kinds of exclusionary things that we've seen through ancestry do throughout history.
Okay, that's fantastic. So if there are no other questions, then this concludes our third annual Global Studies lecture. Did you want to say anything else, Dr. Myers?
I just want to thank Maya for coming to us and giving such a wonderful lecture. And I know I speak for a ton of people. We loved it. Thank you, Maya. It's just wonderful. Perfect.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
A total pleasure.
Thank you for coming to Alfred.
Thank you. And Andrew, so I was just on Friday in Poland looking at the sites of my Jewish origins.
Okay, which cities?
So I went to Białystok.
Okay, I've been there once, but that's
yeah. And so do you study this area, or what's
in World War I Poland?
Okay, I mean, I see your hats up on the shelf behind you.
Yeah, somehow I teach a lot of Soviet history, even though I'm a Germanist. So
yeah. Anyway, I was in Warsaw, and then I went up to Białystok, and then I went to a shtetl 30 kilometers north called Jasanoff, which is presumably the
Yeah, absolutely.
Which we can get a glimpse of on your Instagram shots.
Yes.
Which is so much fun to follow you.
I'm going to post some more tomorrow from that trip. So
that sounds good.
Great.
Anyway, thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
Right. Take care.
Bye.